All right. So our next topic then is morality and religion. For those of you who were watching the QuickTime thing, I should say that the students in the studio here have just completed an exercise that corresponds pretty closely to the second reading exercise that you will do or have done. All right. First, let me give you a sense of the overall agenda with respect to this topic. If we can pop over to the PowerPoint for a second. There we go, yes. So the first thing we're going to do, I should think that that'll probably occupy this session, is talk about divine command theory and the Euthyphro dilemma argument. But then we'll focus also on other relationships between morality and religion, and on natural law theory, the moral and the natural, and the morality of homosexuality. If we could pop back to the other shot for a minute. The first and sort of central focus here then is divine command theory and the Euthyphro dilemma argument. There are sort of three stages that you've got to go through in understanding this topic. Right? We could pop back now to the PowerPoint. First thing you've got to do is understand what divine command theory is. The second thing you've got to do is to understand Socrates' question. And the third thing you've got to do is understand why Socrates' question raises a dilemma for the divine command theorist, by understanding why neither option will be acceptable. All right. If we could switch back. Cool. So start off with the first question then. So divine command theory. So let me ask you. So what's divine command theory? What's the divine command theorist say? Go ahead, yes.
That whether or not an issue is morally right or morally wrong is determined by what God says about the issue. God determines whether something is morally right or morally wrong.
Yeah, that's right. So divine command theory, right, is the idea that for something to be morally right, just is for God to have commanded it. For something to be morally wrong, just is for God to have forbidden it. Right. So we can pop over to PowerPoint. Here's one way of formulating the view. Right. All right, so let's notice a couple of things about this. Right? So look, there's a familiar general idea, right? The general idea that in some way morality is just a branch of religion. Divine command theory is the strongest and most characteristic expression of this general idea. It's a very strong expression of it because, look, according to the divine command theorist, moral properties just are religious properties, right? The very definition of moral terms is in terms of religious stuff, right? Second, if we can pop back to the PowerPoint for a moment, notice that even though it's sort of natural to think of these as equations, as we do here, nonetheless, in an important sense, they have a direction, right? In this sense, the divine command theorist is the person who sort of thinks that the moral stuff is problematic, right? And who's in the position of saying, well, look, here's the deal. This problematic, hard-to-understand moral stuff is to be understood in terms of this unproblematic, easy-to-understand religious stuff. The project, that is, of the divine command theorist is to explain the moral in terms of the religious. Right? All right. So that's the sort of the first stage, the first thing you want to get here. Now, is everyone clear enough on this? All right. So this view has a long history, right? Divine command theory. A version of it, right, is put forward by the character Euthyphro in Plato's dialogue, Euthyphro. Yeah? And in that dialogue, Plato develops an argument against the divine command theory that has had a lot of staying power that many philosophers think is a very powerful argument. That argument has a specific form. It has the form, has the form of a dilemma, right? A dilemma, as we understand it in philosophy, is a kind of problem with a specific structure. Right? In particular, it's a forced choice between two unacceptable options. So to show someone that he or she is in a dilemma, you've got to show that he or she has just two options and that neither of them is acceptable. All right. The second stage here then is understanding Socrates' question. Now it's important here both to be clear what Socrates' question is and to be clear that Socrates' question is not itself the dilemma argument, right? Socrates' question sort of sets up the dilemma argument. It gives you the options, right? But to ask the question is not yet to make or to complete the argument. All right, so let me ask you then, what's Socrates' question, this very famous question that Rachel's talks about? Go ahead.
Is what is right is morally commanded by God, or is does God command it because it's morally right?
That's right. So you want to get these two options with these contrasting directions of causation, right? So the idea is as it's often put, is conduct right because God commands it, or does God command it because it's right? Yeah. I've got a PowerPoint with that on. There we are. You want to go to PowerPoint briefly? There's one way of expressing it. Right? All right, so that question, sets the options, but it's the second stage. But to ask the question, of course, is not yet to make the dilemma argument. In order to make the dilemma argument, what you've got to show is that neither option's going to be acceptable to the divine command theorist. That is, you've got to show the problems that make each of the options unacceptable. This is one of the points where, in my view, recent revisions, recent editions of the Elements of Moral Philosophy have got worse. So, up through the fourth edition, there were two problems alleged for the first option, both of which I think are genuine and independent problems. Right? In the fifth and the one we're using, the sixth edition, you get three alleged problems for the first option, of which, in my view, one is the real and crucial problem, one is not a problem at all, and one is just really another aspect of the central problem. So, I mean, as you'll see in a bit, I actually think that Rachel's discussion of this is somewhat messed up. But that's the textbook. Which is still a jolly good textbook on the whole. Okay, so let's start with the real problem then. So take the option begin with the option, conduct's right because God commands it. So the most important problem for this option is the arbitrariness problem. Right? The arbitrariness problem is this. If conduct is right only because God commands it, then prior to and independently of God's commands, conduct is neither right nor wrong. And that means that God can have no basis on which to make some things right and some things wrong. That means that from God's point of view, it's as if he's got to flip a coin or roll a dice or something in order to decide whether, murder is right or murder is wrong. And that seems unacceptable. So I hope you're getting a sense of the problem. Let me read you Rachel's expressing it too, as I remember he does a decent job of capturing that problem. Let's see what he says. Oh, yes. So this is the first paragraph, top of page 52. He says, this conception of morality makes God's commands arbitrary. We assume that God has good reasons for what he does. But suppose God commands truthfulness to be right. On this theory, he could have given different commands just as easily. He could have commanded us to be liars, and then lying and not truthfulness would be right. After all, before God issues his commands, no reasons for or against lying exist. God is the one who creates the reasons. And so, from a moral point of view, God's commands are arbitrary. This result may seem not only unacceptable, but impious from a religious point of view. That's quite a nice account of that problem. Now, it's worth distinguishing the arbitrariness problem from things people often think are the arbitrariness problem but really aren't. Okay? So people often suppose that the arbitrariness problem is the problem that God might change his mind. But it's not. Okay? It's perfectly possible that having issued his arbitrary commands, God says very firmly, I'm never going to revisit this. If it were that way, then there'd be no concern about the possibility that God would change his mind. But see, that's not the problem. The problem isn't that God might change his mind. The problem is rather that God has no basis on which to make up his mind in the first place. A second thing that people sometimes confuse with the arbitrariness problem involves our knowledge of what's right and wrong. People sometimes think the problem is on this way of seeing things, we won't know what's right and wrong. But again, that's not the problem, right? It's perfectly possible that, having issued his arbitrary commands, God promulgates them so clearly that no one could possibly be confused about them, right? So the problem is not, from our point of view, knowing what God said. The problem, again, is that God had no basis on which to say one thing rather than another in the first place. Okay? All right, so is everyone clear about the arbitrariness problem? Yeah? All right. I mean, if you decide you're unclear at any point, feel free to ask a question. So, I mean, that's the big, the central, the real, genuine problem, I think, for this first option, the option that conduct is right because God commands it. Right? Rachel's, however, alleges two other problems. If we go to the PowerPoint for a sec, I've got all three on this PowerPoint. He alleges not merely the arbitrariness problem, but the problem that this conception of morality is mysterious, and that this conception of morality provides the wrong reasons for moral principles. Go ahead, yeah. We have a question here.
This is over the arbitrary stuff.
Yeah. The arbitrariness stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
The book says that God has no reason, no basis on which to assume it. But
yes.
Besides just saying that, why not ask what is the basis for God's reasoning?
Well, the problem is, right, if you assume, I mean, if you take it that God does have a basis, right, then you're no longer doing the divine command theorist thing, right? Because, I mean, look, the divine command theorist's whole idea is things are made right or wrong simply by God commanding them, right? So it's sort of built into the theory that God has no basis. If you assume some other basis, I mean, we'll get to this more explicitly in another guise in a little bit, but I mean, if you assume he has some basis, then it's no longer true that things are made right or wrong merely by his commanding them. That's the concern. Good. Yeah. All right, so we talked about the first problem, the arbitrariness problem, which I take to be the real and crucial problem, right? But as I say, Rachel alleges these two other problems. And my view, which I will now explain, is that one of them is not a problem at all, and the other one is not a new problem, it's just really another way of, another facet of the arbitrariness problem. Right? Take first the problem that we had as B, this conception of morality is mysterious. Right? This is the one I actually don't think is a problem at all. Let me first read you what Rachel says in explaining it. This is page 51, final 2 paragraphs. He says, this conception of morality is mysterious. What does it mean to say that God makes truthfulness right? It is easy enough to understand how physical objects are made, at least in principle. We've all made something, if only a sandcastle or a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But making truthfulness right is not like that. It could not be done by rearranging things in our physical environment. How then could it be done? No one knows. To see the problem, consider some wretched case of child abuse. On the theory we're now considering, God could make that instance of child abuse right. Not by turning a slap into a friendly pinch of the cheek, but by commanding that the slap is right. This proposal defies human understanding. How could merely saying or commanding that the slap is right make it right? If true, this conception of morality would be a mystery. Okay, there I think Rachel's is just wrong. I don't think this is a real problem at all. Right? It seems to me, look, it's perfectly clear what model the divine command theorist has in mind. The divine command theorist model is the legislative model, right? We're familiar with the ways in which, you know, monarchs and political authorities can make things legal by, you know, declaring that they are required or forbidden in the right sort of way. Yeah? What the divine command theorist does is use that familiar model as the explanation for the source of moral rightness and wrongness. Right? So I don't think it's mysterious at all how it's supposed to work. Right? I mean, it's God as moral legislator, right? And there's nothing intrinsically mysterious about that idea. I mean, for other reasons, I don't think it's a good idea, but I don't think it's, as Rachel's here suggests, impossible to understand what's supposed to be going on. What's supposed to be going on is that moral rightness and wrongness is created by divine legislation, right? And I think there's nothing puzzling about the basic idea. So my line is, that alleged problem is not a problem at all. Okay? All right. There's then a third alleged problem. The third alleged problem is the problem that, as Rachel's puts it, and we had this on the PowerPoint, this conception of morality provides the wrong reasons for moral principles. He talks about this, the second and third paragraphs on 52. He writes, this conception of morality provides the wrong reasons for moral principles. There are many things wrong with child abuse. It is malicious. It involves the unnecessary infliction of pain. It can have unwanted long-term psychological effects and so on. However, the theory we're now considering cannot recognize any of these reasons as important. All it cares about in the end is whether child abuse runs counter to God's commands. There are two ways of confirming that something is wrong here. First, notice something the theory implies. If God didn't exist, child abuse wouldn't be wrong. This is so because if God didn't exist, then God wouldn't be around to make child abuse wrong. However, child abuse would still be malicious, so it would still be wrong. Thus, the divine command theory fails. Second, keep in mind that even a religious person might be genuinely in doubt as to what God has commanded. After all, religious texts disagree with each other, and sometimes there seem to be inconsistencies even within a single text. So a person might be in doubt as to what God's will really is. However, a person needn't be in doubt as to whether child abuse is wrong. What God has commanded is one thing. What's wrong with hitting children is another. Okay, look, my take on this is there is a genuine problem here, but it's not a new problem. It's just really another way of seeing the arbitrariness problem, or sort of the other side of the coin of the arbitrariness problem. Right? I mean, The point of the arbitrariness problem is things are made right on this view simply by God's commanding them. There's no other basis. Right? The flip side of that, which is, I take it, what Rachel is pointing to here, is the things that we ordinarily take to be the basis of the wrongness, you know, child abuse being malicious, etc., are not the basis, right? Because the only basis is God's commanding it. Right? So, I mean, what I want to say about that again is, I mean, in a way it's a real problem, right? But it's not a new and independent problem, right? It's just another way of fixing on the central problem, which is really better captured as the arbitrariness problem, right? It's a way of fixing on the problem that, on this theory, what makes stuff right is just God's arbitrary, baseless commands, nothing else, right? And, you know, what this alleged independent problem amounts to is, well, you know, if that's the basis, then all this other stuff that we ordinarily take to be the basis isn't, right? All right. Is everyone with me so far on this stuff? Well, that's good, right? If we manage this far, we've done an important part of the work. But look, if this were the end of the story, it wouldn't be a dilemma, right? If this were the end of the story, then we'd have a choice between one unacceptable option, the option that conduct's right because God commands it, and one perfectly fine option, the option that God commands conduct because it's right. Put that another way. In order to show that there's a dilemma here, you've got to explain what's problematic about the other option as well. Right? So let me ask you then, what is problematic about the idea that God commands conduct because it's right? Yes?
The problem is that means that God is not in control of what's right and wrong. And if God's supposed to be in control of everything, how is he not in control of what's right and wrong?
Okay, good. So you put that in what's interesting. I mean, it's the form that people most characteristically put it, although, as I'll show you in a minute, it's not what Rachel says, and it's actually, in the end, for reasons that I don't expect you to see until I point them out, not, I think, ultimately the best way to put it, right? But look, so you say the problem is if God commands stuff because it's right, then there's standards of right and wrong independent of God. So God's not in control of them, so God's not all-powerful. But God's supposed to be all-powerful. Right? So the problem then, on this way of seeing it, is to take that option, to take the option that God commands it because it's right, is to undermine God's omnipotence. Right? Interestingly, right, that's not how Rachel sets it up. Does anyone have a way of, you may or may not, anyone have a way of explaining the problem the way Rachel does? Anyone want to try that? Let me read you what he says. This is page 53, first full paragraph. Unfortunately, this second option leads to a different problem. In taking this option, we abandon the theological conception of right and wrong. When we say that God commands us to be truthful because truthfulness is right, we acknowledge a standard that is independent of God's will. The rightness exists prior to God's command and is the reason for the command. So what do you think he means there by the theological conception of right and wrong? Go ahead.
I think that what's trying to be explained is that there's a standard there that is independent of, well, that there can be right and wrong without God.
Independent of God's will, yeah. So I mean, that's right. So on any way of explaining what's problematic here, you kind of start with the idea okay, to take this option is to admit a standard of right and wrong that's independent of God's will. But then the next thing to say is, okay, why is that problematic? What makes that problematic? And we've had one explanation here. The thought is, what makes it problematic is if you say that, you're giving up on God's omnipotence, right? But I suggest in the passage that I was just reading, Rachel's has a different story about what makes that problematic. And the key to seeing what that different story is seeing what he means by the theological conception of right and wrong here. Okay, so look, by the theological conception of right and wrong, what he means is divine command theory. Right? It's sort of an unfortunate bit of writing, I think. I mean, actually, I was one of the reviewers of, I think, the second edition, you know, into the change of the third edition. I did tell him to fix this, and he didn't. But, I mean, it would be much clearer, I think, if he used the term he'd been using throughout the thing. But, I mean, that's what it means, right? So, look, on that different account of what makes the second option problematic, what makes it problematic to admit a standard of right and wrong independent of God's will is that if you do that, you've given up on divine command theory, right? Because you're no longer saying that stuff's made right and wrong by God commanding it. You're saying that it's, you know, made right and wrong independently. Right? So then, we have two different ways of explaining why option 2 is problematic. And if we can pop over to the PowerPoint. Here they are. All right, so I said I think what we had as A is the better account of the problem here. Let me explain why. There are sort of two reasons. A historical reason and a philosophical reason. Background, look. If you see the problem the way you do if you take it that the problem is B, you're imagining the argument, in effect, directed in some general way against the standard conception of God. By contrast, if you see the problem for option 2 the way you do if you see it as A, you're seeing the argument as directed specifically against the divine command theorist. There are two reasons that that way of doing it, seeing it as directed specifically against the divine command theorist, better, okay? Is better, I think. First off, this is the sort of historical reason, right? Look, I mean, where does this argument get its start? Well, it gets its start in Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, as an argument directed against the character Euthyphro. And then you ask, okay, so what does Euthyphro believe? The answer is Euthyphro's a divine command theorist, a distinctive ancient version of a divine command theorist who is a polytheist and stuff, but still it's the same basic idea. So that's a sort of historical reason for seeing the argument as directed against divine command theory, and so the problem for option 2 as being problem A. Now for the philosophical reason, which probably ultimately carries more weight. Right? Philosophical reason is there's a good response, or at least a promising response, to the problem if you conceive it in the second way as involving omnipotence. In a way, there isn't a good response to the problem if you conceive it as involving divine command theory. So look, it is possible to deny that admitting a standard of right and wrong independent of God's will undermines God's omnipotence. Here's how you do, natural way to do that. Do it by appeal to analogy, right? You can say, look, even God could not make it the case that 2 plus 3 was 6. I mean, sure, God could make it the case that the words 2 and plus and 3 and equals and 6 had meanings in a language very much like English, such that in that language they expressed a necessary truth. But that would not be to make it true that 2 plus 3 equals 6. Even God couldn't do that. But, the person continues, that doesn't show God's not omnipotent, right? To be omnipotent is to be able to change anything it's possible to change. It's not possible to change the fact that 2 plus 3 is 5, but the fact that it's not possible to do that, and so God can't do it, doesn't show God's not omnipotent, right? To be omnipotent is to be able to change anything it's possible to change, right? Even God can't make 2 plus 3 6. Similarly, the person objecting to the one account of what's problematic about option 2 here says, look, similarly, even God couldn't make it the case that torturing innocent children just for fun is right. That doesn't show God's not omnipotent, because again, to be omnipotent is to be able to change anything it's possible to change. It's not possible to change the fact that torturing innocent children just for fun is wrong, so God couldn't change that. But that doesn't show he's not omnipotent. So that's a response to that, as we had its second account of the problem there, right? That involves denying that, admitting a standard of rightness or wrongness independent of God's will shows that God's not omnipotent. I'm not saying you have to buy that, right? I mean, someone could insist, no. If God's really omnipotent, God would have to be able to make it the case that torturing innocent children just for fun is right. They could do that two ways, right? They could say, well, God would have to be able to change that, though God wouldn't have to be able to change the fact that 2 plus 3 is 5 rather than 6, right? Or the person could insist, no, God could make it the case that 2 plus 3 is 6, right? I mean, that latter one, I must say, I find puzzling, right? I mean, I know people sometimes do want to say stuff like that, but, I find it myself hard to imagine how it's supposed to work. But again, let me be clear about what the force of this is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be that the omnipotence problem clearly doesn't work. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying the omnipotence problem is sort of dodgier than the other problem, right? Because there is this response to it. There's something to be said for the response, right? So if you explain the dilemma, explaining the problem for option 2 as involving undermining God's omnipotence, you're liable to face this objection where there's no corresponding objection if you explain the problem as involving rejecting divine command theory. So that's why that's the better account of the problem. Okay? So understood then, I think, the implication of the Euthyphro dilemma argument, what it shows is divine command theory must be rejected. Right? Morality and religion can't be connected the way the divine command theorist says they are. Let me finally on this topic notice two more things. One is kind of when you bring it to the surface, funny response to the argument here that people sometimes have. Funny but revealing response. And second, what that helps bring out is what kind of conception of moral objectivity you're rejecting when you give up on divine command theory. Right? So start off with the sort of funny response. Right? So people sometimes go through a line of thought that comes out something like this. They say, well, okay, so divine command theory shows that it can't be God who makes stuff right and wrong. So it must be someone else, right? And if they develop this picture, that you sort of think, well, maybe it's God too, right? I mean, we showed that it couldn't be that things are made right or wrong by God one, so it must be God too standing behind God one who makes things right. Now, of course, I mean, if you think about it, then you just run the same argument against God too, right? And then if this person is still kind of trapped in this conception, then they might say, oh, it's God 3, right? And of course, when you bring it to the surface, there's got to be the wrong way to do it, right? It's got to be the wrong way to do it because when you really see the implications of the Euthyphro dilemma argument, what you see is that argument shows that you should give up on the picture of moral objectivity according to which moral objectivity is a matter of what someone commands. Because look, I mean, who is, as it were, the very best candidate to be the being whose commands make stuff right and wrong? Answer God, right? If this conception doesn't work with God being the maker of the commands, it's sure not going to work with anyone else being the maker of the commands. So the right response to have is not what the person who I was just talking about goes through this funny bit of thinking does, which is sort of desperately try to find someone else to fill the slot which won't work when you have God doing the commanding. It's to give up on the whole idea that moral objectivity is to be understood as a matter of what someone commanded, a matter of what someone said. Right? That doesn't mean giving up on the idea of moral objectivity. Right? I mean, there are a bunch of other possible stories about what moral objectivity consists in, about what makes stuff right and wrong. Yeah? But if you buy the Euthyphro dilemma argument, you should reject one possible such story, right? The possible such story that says what makes stuff right or wrong is simply someone saying so, right? Because again, if it doesn't work when God's the one saying so, it's sure not going to work if anyone else is. All right, good. So the next thing to do is to turn to other distinct possible relationships between morality and religion, other ways in which morality and religion might be connected, different from the way specified by divine command theory. But I think we're best to leave that topic for next time. So we're done for today.